Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where in my own words, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. So today's topic is long awaited. We're going to talk about ayahuasca. Ta-da! So I've prepared my show notes like always in split screen, but I feel like just sharing a little bit of my personal background, because truth be told, I've been waiting for many years. So this is episode 48 we're recording, to really sense into the right setting for myself, as well as the people that I want to share such an intimate conversation. So I feel like framing that conversation is, I actually feel like I want to share this from a sacred and a ceremonial place. And why ayahuasca? I'm not approaching this conversation from the phenomenon at large out there as it is perceived by people, but from a humble point of a practitioner myself. And having committed, I think, a plethora of mistakes in my own healing journey. And certainly in my early days of drinking ayahuasca, I was drinking it for the first time in 2011, so 13 years ago. And I've done roundabout, I always say 100 ceremonies. So it's a little bit hard to say if I did 85, 92, or 108, but it's a lot. And within those ceremonial spaces, I've been witnessing a lot of things that made me, I would say, critical towards the phenomenon at large. Because when you sit in ceremony, as specifically with ayahuasca, you become aware, much like that metaphor of a sharp knife, you know, where you have a surgeon that can cut out like a tumor, but you can also civilly hurt yourself. So that's a little bit of my personal background. And before I introduce my guests, I want to read a quote from famous and infamous Terence McKenna, which beautifully paraphrases, I think, the underlying tonality of that sacred space we're sharing together. And the quote goes as following: "Ayahuasca loves to take prideful people and rub their noses in it. I mean, it can make you beg for mercy like nothing. You have to really approach it humbly." So it's my great pleasure to be in that virtual room together today with Lacey and Luna and Todd Michael Roberts. When you, Todd, then frame how we met, I definitely want to mention that like karmic moment when we met for the first time. And they have both have decades of experience with plant medicine and are deeply rooted in the Shipibo tradition, which is one of the core traditions where they serve ayahuasca. And they have both served as head facilitators at some of the most renowned institutions. They are now offering themselves ceremonies in the Sacred Valley in Peru, where they built their own container and process design with the aim at refining their experiences, both holding an indigenous perspective as well as combining it with Western approaches for preparation and integrating these peak experiences with a special focus on being trauma-informed. So that sets a little bit the tone, and like always in my podcast, and I make it juicy, make it free. Like I always ask my guests, what are the pivotal moments in your biography that tie you together with the topic of today's podcast? And I would like to go first with Lacey before we hear Todd. So Lacey, the floor is yours. Really curious how your biography, interfaces with ayahuasca.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. My plant medicine journey started in 2010, and it was about a year after meeting Wachuma for the first time that I came to the Sacred Valley, Peru, and I met ayahuasca for the first time. And as a beginner, it's like you don't really know what you're getting into. You hear things from other people, and or you read experiences online and things like that. And we don't really have the understanding as a beginner of what spaces should look like, how they should feel, what the people that are holding the container, what their experience should be, what their knowledge should be, and things like that. And while I look back upon those early days and first experiences, especially with ayahuasca, they weren't held, those ceremonies weren't held in in necessarily like a terrible manner, but knowing what I know now, I absolutely would never participate in those ceremonies that once upon a time they were all I knew. And so yeah, that was basically all the ceremonies leading up to where I am now, and having worked at large centers and things like that. I always made mental notes of how things should be different, and how I felt in those scenarios where um, it was obviously not held to what I would say the highest degree of integrity. Um, Situations that I wasn't entirely comfortable with the staff, I wasn't entirely comfortable with the facilitators, and things like that. And yeah, it just basically gave me the motivation to eventually create my own ayahuasca haven, knowing that people are coming to these spaces looking for really, really, really deep healing. People are trusting you with their lives. They're trusting you with your mind, with their minds, and everything like that. And yeah, it's incredibly important to bring not only the ceremonial and sacred aspect of like the indigenous tradition, but also be able to help people process that through their Western minds and through like cultural differences, and the understandings of psychology and things like that. And also I'm a yoga teacher, and I always found that yoga and meditation were really important modalities, not only like the leading up process to ceremonies and things like that and to retreats, but especially in the integration process that can sometimes feel like the wild, wild west, as we're trying to go back into our familiar environments and same triggers and things like that that were there before. And how do we integrate these new experiences, and how do we become like an embodied version of those things that come through in the ceremonies, and the downloads that come through and everything like that. And I always found that yoga and meditation were the tools that grounded those experiences for me and helped me to implement those and practice those into everyday life. That's like the real work of the medicine. It's not so much the, oh my gosh, and ceremony, all the beautiful downloads and things that come through and the aha moments. It's how do we apply those into real life? And so that's where I got the inspiration of like, how did these tools that really changed my life with the Eastern practices, how can we bridge those with the indigenous tradition of ayahuasca? And so, yeah, it's been a long journey and a lot of learning, of course, not only through my own healing process, but holding containers and spaces for other people in large centers, and how would I do this different? And also like the focus on small group containers, because the large centers, I feel like, have a really important role with introducing a lot of people to ayahuasca and everything like that. But it's really in the smaller and more intimate spaces that I feel like the walls come down for people. And that's for me personally as well. In the really, really big ceremonies, I just felt like another fish in the sea, as opposed to the smaller containers where I could really let my own guard drop and talk one-on-one with the facilitators and everything like that. And also get to know like the space holders, the healers, and everything. That was really pivotal in my own journey, and understanding the importance of like that container setting as well. So
yeah, there's a lot to unpack, which we will do in a very structured way. What touches me most is when you were sharing that people truly trust you with their lives. Because I certainly know from my own experience, also having started with very large containers, and I think I was then really just lucky of having found both small group settings, as well as people that knew both the psychedelic and, let's say, indigenous perspective, but also had the, let's say, toolkits, methodologies, and their own wisdom from a Western tradition to help me integrate these peak experiences. Because I think that's, I'm time and again trying to underline the important things in the podcast, because it's not that ayahuasca necessarily just fixes it. It's like you fly once to Peru, Costa Rica, wherever, or just do it in Berlin like I did most of my life, and then it's done. This is like this Western mindset of like, you get the medicine and it fixes you, like an aspirin pill when you have a headache. But the real work, and I think also the longer time frame within which needs to be situated an own healing journey, is something that I want to underline. Todd, when we now listen into your biography and maybe also how you met and why you're doing that together, really just curious to listen in, because I mean, you come with, yeah, truly almost 2 decades of being like in the industry at large, but also having, yeah, worked as a facilitator.
Thank you. Thank you, Alistair, for having us on here. My history with ayahuasca goes back over 20 years, and it started for me even before that, as when I was a kid, as a child growing up. I was always interested in alternative things like Sasquatch and shamanism and UFOs and mysteries and things like that. And I had my first initiation with ayahuasca on Vancouver Island. It was in February of 2004. And what Lacey brought up, like I first started working with Shipibo trained apprentices. These were Western people that had trained with Shipibo maestros in Peru, in the Amazon, and then had brought the medicine up north. Initially, before that, I had experiences with mushrooms. That was my first psychedelic that I ever used right after high school, and then with LSD, and then with cannabis. And so then I had an interest in plant medicines. Back then, there wasn't a term called plant medicines. And inevitably wanting to explore these psychedelics and working with these psychedelics, what inevitably happened was working with mushrooms. I feel that it brought me towards ayahuasca and learning about other plant medicines and psychedelics that were traditionally used in the Amazon and different places around the world. So I ended up working with a specific group of people on Vancouver Island for about 8 years. And then I ended up in the Amazon in 2012. And I went to the Temple of the Way of Light as a guest, and I was there for 3 months. And then I had friends that were working there at the time. So then they asked me to come back and train as a facilitator. So that was really the first foray into that relationship with the medicine at a different level. And I ended up spending 5 years in the Amazon, being connected to the Temple of the Way of Light, working as a facilitator. After that, I took about 1.5 years off for my own integration, because that was quite a long period of time to be so embedded in the medicine, and I needed to kind of poke my head out and somewhat find myself and take myself out of that situation. So zooming back, when I first started, there was no such thing as integration. There were no words like that. Our circles, our medicine circles, were underground. Sometimes kind of the spaces were a bit wild. They weren't really held well. There weren't facilitators. Sometimes there wasn't anybody that was actually facilitating, that was sober, that was holding the space. We had groups of probably a max of like 18 people in houses, in living rooms, in spaces that could fit people. And it was typically, for the first few years, it was always different. Then naturally, the course that started to happen was we started to hone in and simplify our group. We simplified our setting. It ended up being in the same place most of the time. At that time as well, probably near the end of those 8 years, 2010, we started working with North American indigenous traditions and working with Sweat Lodge and bringing that into the setting as well. When I left the temple in 2017, and then I had like 1.5 years of my own integration time, a lot of life lessons came up that the previous years really prepared me for that I can really see now. Then after that 1.5 years, I ended up coming back to Peru, and I was working for another small retreat center here in the Sacred Valley where we live. So it's actually kind of funny that we live here now. That's kind of what happens. It's actually what happened when I had my very first ayahuasca ceremony. I ended up moving back there 2 years later, next door to the very first place that I ever sat in ceremony, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, being here, a friend of mine was working in Costa Rica at another major center called Soltara, and he invited me up there, and I ended up going up and becoming a facilitator. And so that was in 2019. And I was part of Soltara Healing Center from 2019 until March of last year. And in that time, I was facilitating for basically, I would say about 3 years. And then I became the director, one of the director of retreats for a couple of years, before I resigned from that position. So it's been, when I look back in the 20 years, it's been a fruitful and lengthy process. That's for sure. It's been more a part of my life than anything else, really, my connection with ayahuasca. So I'm very grateful for all the things that I have learned and lived through, and the people I've met, all those things. There's a lot of gratitude for all of that.
Before I want to segue into a more structured conversation about like integrity and how to serve medicine in integrity, and really take that as an open conversation of how do we define integrity, and what's the right like setting and the ratio of facilitators and the right way to vet people if they're ready for such a strong intervention. And nevertheless, I want to sprinkle in that beautiful detail when we met, because I remember you picked me out of a crowd dancing and in Berlin, and I was literally just coming out of an ayahuasca ceremony. And that's now, if I remember rightly, so 2012 or 13,
no,
something like that.
It was 2014.
Was it 2014? But I mean, 10 years. And what
it was
I find
Sunday.
Exactly. And what I find very interesting is we're recording this podcast in 2024. And for whatever reason, this joint space, which I would coin sacred, it's a sacred communion with a plant spirit, which can be very demanding, but also very healing. For whatever reason, had a sacred bond in between the two of us. And what then happened again, just like 6 weeks ago or something like that, when I was actually again coming out of an ayahuasca ceremony, you were writing me from Peru. So anyhow, I just felt like sometimes sprinkling in this biographical details just makes a podcast more juicy. So,
and then there's the part of Lacey and myself meeting too, which I cannot forget. So
then
there's the segue into this part.
Yeah.
So Lacey, I ended up hiring, when I was director, I ended up hiring Lacey as a facilitator at Soltara. But we both knew of each other, and she had been here in the Sacred Valley basically since 2020, and that's when she also started intertwining medicines. But she's also working with very good friends of mine, also my ex-wife, and doing plant medicine work, ayahuasca ceremonies and dietas with them. And she also was at the Temple of the Way of Light, and so she had heard of me, and somehow I remember hearing of her. Things are just kind of floating around or whatever, and then lo and behold, she comes and works at Soltara, and now here we are.
And now here we are.
Here we are.
Can't forget this piece.
And I want to start because we have a lot to cover. I want to start the conversation consciously with a rather generic question, and I don't mind who of you answers the question, or both of you, because I remember you taught in the preparation leading up to the recording, your main question was, why do people do ayahuasca? And make this question part of the assessment. So my question is like, why do you think people do ayahuasca? And how would you qualify, depending on their answer, if they're really the right candidate to invite them into a sacred ceremony, or maybe not?
Yeah, there's a multitude of reasons why people get called to the medicine, called to ayahuasca. It's a very common term, called to the medicine. Generally, I say most generally, it's people that get called to the medicine. The ayahuasca comes to people through hearing about it from other people, more so now through media because it's a lot more out there, it's a lot more popular. When I started, it was a thing that I read in a book about plant medicines from it was like a anthropologist or something like that. And it was this mysterious thing, and it really drew me into it. I didn't come to ayahuasca myself to heal things. I really didn't. I was exploring. So there's people that come to the medicine truly with the intention. This is the thing. It's all about the intentions, the intention to heal something specific or heal something in general. Because sometimes and I know this from myself, there can be a sense or a feeling of there's a disconnection to what it is that wants to come and be healed, that wants to come to the forefront sometimes. Sometimes that's at the forefront. It's very present for people. So there's the healing and curing aspect of the medicine. That's why we call it the medicine. And then there's the exploration side of it, which used to be, from my perspective, used to be a lot more prevalent, especially when I started working in bigger centers early on, back in 2012. That was also a potent time. But also when I started myself, the groups of people were coming in because they'd heard of it. It was recommended by their friends or family, and they came together and they wanted to explore in that sense. And then things start to come out because of that. And it's also another aspect that we've been talking about is the medicine it will draw out things from people in their healing aspect, on their healing journey, whether they know it or not. So some people come in and they're exploring, but they also come in with a bit more of an intention of wanting to figure things out that are related to their vocation or their work or their job or things like that. But I would say one of the most common things, if not the most common things, or thing that people come to look into or to explore is purpose. What's my purpose? And that's like the bubble on the whiteboard that fans out into all sorts of things. Purpose. What am I doing here? What is my self-worth? What is this life? What is this existence? Real deeper questions. So people coming in with questions and looking for insight, looking for some kind of answer. Yeah.
Lacey, I have a lot to reciprocate, but before I reciprocate, anything you want to nuance from what Todd shared?
To echo what he just shared, a lot of people come in with an array of reasons. And even for me, much like Todd, my introduction to plant medicine had nothing to do with healing. In my early 20s, I was quite the cosmonaut with whatever I could get my hands on, whether that was mushrooms or LSD or strange molecules and stuff like that. So yeah, but it was more like once I started with plant medicine, once I experienced the aftermath of it and what started to really shift in big ways in my life, it was like, oh, this is a healing medicine. Okay, I got to keep going back to this. I'm learning more about myself than I ever did in therapy and some of the other modalities that I was using up until that point. So I think a lot of it is curiosity for some people. There's also people that come in that hear about it and it's kind of like a bucket list item, so they're able to check that off. But a lot of people are very surprised with the places that they go with ayahuasca. Just within one immersion or one retreat, they come in with like a laundry list of, okay, I want to tackle the trauma from my child about this. I want to explore and heal the relationship I have with my partner, and this, that, a whole laundry list. And then where the medicine actually takes them is somewhere completely different that they had no idea that actually needed the most work. And that's like the beauty and the intelligence and the technology of the medicine, is it's going to take us to the places sometimes that we are not expecting, and had no idea that thing it took us to was number one that needed the healing before we could address all the other things on the list. And so it's interesting from the perspective of being on the side of working a space or facilitating people and stuff like that, because you start to see these repeating patterns that seems to be generalized and can be applied to the whole. When it comes to people that are candidates versus people that really ayahuasca is not ready for them, mostly depends on any kind of contraindications that they might have, whether that's like a psychological contraindications, or if they are super fresh out of addiction, or like literally just quit drinking or hardcore drug use or something like that. And then also like physical contraindications as well, depending on the condition of their body or organs and things like that. So, yeah.
When I try to segue, underlying the try to segue into trying to come to grips with what makes serving ayahuasca in integrity a question, I want to start with an own short biographical memory that I was certainly one of the guys that, without better knowing about it, I certainly overdid the medicine. So I remember somewhat 40, maybe 50 ceremonies up until I met, this must now be, I don't know, 8 years ago or something like that, a trained trauma therapist that was assessing my case. For the first time, I really had the feeling that somebody who understands me in my learning journey, and then really just said, sweetheart, let's do the following. Your biggest challenge is sobriety, which was the case because of my addiction issues before, mainly with alcohol and marijuana. And she simply said, how about you take at least 1 full year, like straight edge sober, and trust that with all the experiences you made, you have pulled to the surface enough material that you now need to integrate in your everyday life. And that was a very like striking experience, because obviously, which I think a lot of people do, because of a lack of better guidance, is like some people start with the medicine and then they think more medicine is the answer. So I want to start this part of the conversation with your own experience, and like, when is maybe more medicine not at all the right answer for the client?
I think when a lot of people start to see very fresh out of a retreat the big things that came through and this new perspective on life, and there typically tends to be that space of the afterglow, and not realizing that once the afterglow fades, there tends to also be waves, that need to settle in, like in the pond, like all these things that got stirred up, like how you just mentioned, these ripples in the pond. And so for some people, they think that the way to kind of combat the waves, which are inevitable, is to go back to medicine again, because they're chasing the afterglow, as opposed to using it in such a manner of like making and implementing positive change in their life. And the thing with being in the medicine space and being in that afterglow and then going back into it and everything, it doesn't offer much time or space for clarity to come through. And that can only be achieved with time specifically away from the medicine, so we can come back to being like the human with the human mind and with the human psyche and everything like that. Because if it's just medicine, our brains literally cannot process that amount of ayahuasca and everything. So for those things to really anchor in and take root, so that we can grow into that version of ourselves that we're aiming for and everything, we have to give ourselves space and time in the integration process. Now, that being said, everyone's journey does look different, because there are some people that can sense right away after a retreat, I do not need medicine for a long time after this. And maybe they don't go back to medicine for a year, 2 years, 3 years, But then there's other people that go full on and say, I know there's more to uncover and I'm ready. So this is there's a fine line with also gauging people's personal journeys with it, because there are those that chase the next experience, but then there are those that are ready for a deeper immersion in like the next experience or the next healing container, and they can handle it. So that's another thing, that like some people are able to handle those healing experiences and retreats and big things shifting, and be able to implement those amazing, beautiful insights that come through and make changes and then go back to the medicine. But then there's other people that would absolutely rock them, and it would be so emotionally destabilizing too, that if they don't have a lot of support around them in community or friends or family in their integration process, they can almost from the outside appear like they're going a little bit crazy, you know. And so everyone's journey looks a little bit different. I like to honor that, but at the same time, for most people, they don't need to go back in and go back in and go back in and go back in and keep chasing like the ayahuasca high, so to speak.
Todd?
Yeah, wow, that's a really good topic. I'm just reflecting on my own experiences with that, and my companions' experiences with that in the early circles. Those were very interesting times, because we were peppering our lives with like a weekend of ayahuasca ceremonies. So for me, on average, I would have like a ceremony every 3 months. But I also had periods of time. I did have like, in the first year, after my first year, I had like a year off, because there was a contamination in the circle. There was like a contamination with the supposed curandero that we were working with. So things disbanded for a while. So we naturally just had more space and time. But I remember in that time, I wanted to get back into it more and more. And it was only later that I started to see in other people. And then later when I was working at centers, that there's people that come in and they have a retreat, and that's it for the rest of their lives. They're good. They just know. That's a low percentage. And then there's people that tend to feel like there's always something that they need to keep working on. It becomes their thing. It becomes their modality. And there's many other modalities to do that same thing with, right? To have that aspect in one's life and get addicted to it or overdo it and get really caught up in it. And I've seen that with ayahuasca, is people getting really caught up in it, and they never take themselves out of it. They don't take the medicine from their journeys and use it in their daily life to have that experience. That's one of the earliest things I started to see when I was working at a large center, was like, okay, especially with people that were working there themselves, you get so deep into it, so embedded into it, because it's there at your disposal all the time. Back in Canada, it wasn't at our disposal all the time. It was something that was very difficult to become part of, because it was so underground. It was very difficult to even get your hands on the medicine. You had to come down to Peru and find somebody and on all of that. So it's a really key point about having experiences in ceremony, your ceremony experiences, and then having reprieve or time off to be able to integrate those experiences. But part of integration isn't just internally, it's what are you doing with that medicine out in the world afterwards? That's a major part of the experience. That's where you really get to see how it plays out and how it all interacts and how it actually works as part of life.
Yeah, before I go on to the next question, I feel like I want to dovetail into what you just shared. Is like I come ultimately from a background. So I did my first psychedelic experience pretty late in my life, besides twice mushrooms in my later teens. But then truly with at the age of 32, I only did like MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and then literally my first, like, let's say, magical compound was ayahuasca. and I think I had a mix of curiosity and healing, but what I wanted to share comes more from the background of having spent like a couple of years like in monasteries, Christian monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, and Vipassana, and ultimately people confounding or conflating the ceremonial space with everyday life. Because I think at least those maestros, curanderos, healers, shamans, monks that I've been working with, they have always been pointing, well, the real ceremony is after the ceremony, in as much as these altered states of consciousness are certainly peak experiences to understand life itself, this mystical experience that we make as human beings, but also other non-human and other sentient beings like plants or even minerals. But ultimately, I think what I needed to become aware of, I think after 3, 4, 5 years of way overdoing ayahuasca, that I had all these blissful oneness experiences and having maybe this found like this magic, how do you say, philosopher's stone or so, I think you say in English, but then needing to come to grips with like, wait, Alistair, your everyday life as an impact entrepreneur, as a social entrepreneur, as a partner, in relationship with your own patterns and addictions and whatnot in everyday life, that's actually the bigger conundrum, at least for me, it was. I want to ask both of you a question that I think for newbies in the field, and I think also for some of the more experienced people they're not so much aware of, is that medicine is not always the same medicine. So when people talk about ayahuasca, there's different ways to do the brew. And also it seems some people add certain things into the brew that may better not be in the brew. So the question goes something like where do you source the ayahuasca from? What's an ethical list of ingredients in the brew? So just to educate the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking from the tradition of Shipibo, they only include 2 plants. That would be the vine and the chacruna leaf. There are some ayahuascas out there where they don't even bother adding the chacruna. It's just the vine, which is a purge heavy experience and not as visionary. But with the uprising and popularity of ayahuasca in general and kind of what is labeled as like the ayahuasca boom, there's been more centers and more people offering retreats and ceremonies where they are catering to deliver the most psychedelic experience possible with ayahuasca, which then would include adding other plants, perhaps other visionary plants. There's an established center that right on their website that says that they add up to 16 to 20 plants, but I mean, who knows what those actually are? Maybe if you're to write to them, they would give you the list. But typically speaking, most people that are new to ayahuasca, or even people that have been around, might not have any understanding of what some of these plants actually are. They might be written in the Latin name or Spanish name or something like that, but unless it's like Western plants that we're familiar with, like maybe rosemary or thyme, I'm of course listing like culinary herbs, but they're plants that we grow up with. Most Westerners have no idea what types of plants, Amazonian plants specifically, are added into these brews that can, of course, make an experience range from absolutely blissful to like almost delirium. A lot of some of these types of plants are considered very, very dangerous because it can push a person to their psychological edge that some of them are known to cause psychiatric breaks and stuff like that. And also there's a longer duration with some plants as well. That a typical ayahuasca ceremony is, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. People can, of course, journey throughout the night and maybe even feel the effects of the medicine lightly the next day. But some plants that are added into mixtures can literally put a person into like a state of hypnosis or delirium for weeks afterwards, depending on the plant and everything. And so I think it's really important that people do ask wherever they're going or wherever they're about to be served with medicine, what are the plants in this brew, and also who made it. It's because ingredients can also be found online and things like that. And there are people that deem themselves as healer or shaman that actually don't have a whole lot of experience and will create their own brews and try to make them as powerful and strong and trippy as possible and things like that without even putting intention into what they're doing, creating literally like a magical sacred drink. And so these types of things are obviously very important to ask about. And yeah, I think the more people have this awareness going into a ceremony and have the right list of questions to be asking, perhaps it can prevent harm and bad situations from happening.
So I certainly know I did drink a couple of different brews, and my gut feeling especially is that the first maybe 4 to 5 experiences were most likely a wild mix, because after that, when it's really just the 2 main ingredients, and you know how to sail or navigate at least stretches of the experience, it feels always familiar. I think for people that have already done ceremonies and are undergoing another ceremony, I think that could also be a guideline. Also, like with other compounds like mushrooms, usually if you've done 10 times mushrooms, you do it an 11th time, then you have a feeling of what you're navigating with. Todd, is there anything when it comes to specifically the ingredients in the brew and how it is sourced and prepared that you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, typically when it comes to, so we're working with the vine and the ayahuasca vine and the leaf of the chacruna. So the leaf has the dimethyltryptamine, the chacruna, and the vine has the MAOI inhibitor, but it also has other alkaloids, harmines. And so those other alkaloids that are in the vine, they also have a visceral visionary effect. The dimethyltryptamine of the chacruna has the visionary effect. So what will those are, as Lacey said, the basic 2 ingredients of any Shipibo brew is just those 2. There can be variations of the vine because there's 3 different types of vine that the Shipibo recognize. But if you go up into Colombia, there's 18 different kinds of vine that they would recognize, this certain indigenous group. There are other alternatives to using chacruna as well. There's wambisa, which I've worked with. That was a brew that came when I was working at the temple, that came through because there was a shortage of ayahuasca and they got it from somebody else. It was fine. What brings it up though is that the person that was making this particular brew, in the preparation, it's also very simple. You're harvesting the vine. The vine itself, from our teacher and from what I've known for many years, it should at least be 5 years old. So it has time to grow. There is a concern, there has been a concern about over harvesting of ayahuasca vine itself. Some people will say it's still a problem. Some people say it's not such a problem. So there's that aspect. But in accordance with the brew itself, when it's made, what's the intention going into it? So yes, who's making the brew? So for our retreats, our Maestro Nelson, he's making the brew, or it's his brother. And it's made from the constituents that are harvested off their own land in that sense. In Iquitos, you can go into the market and buy all these things. I remember when I lived in Japan, I was teaching English in 2002. I could walk into a head shop at that point, not anymore, but I could buy the constituents for ayahuasca. There's that piece though about the intention that goes into it, because the brewing process is minimum 8 hours up to like a couple of days as they're cooking it. And so there are certain aspects that go into that when they are holding the space, while they're not just preparing it, but while it's brewing, the intentions that they're putting into it, the prayers, the thoughts. Are they fasting as well? Like really putting that sacred intentionality into the brew. I feel like I've had brew that had none of that, for sure.
Yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
I've also had brew that I know had an admixture into it. Dare I say what it is? Some people will know what I'm talking about. We used to call it a cheat. It's a particular plant. It's actually very well known. It's one of the strongest hallucinogenic plants on the planet. It needs to be used with such caution and reverence. But this plant has been put in the brew, as I said, as like a cheat to increase the visions. What that would do early on, I've had an experience with that early on in my like fourth and fifth ceremonies. I didn't know it was in there till later, but what it did is it created chaos throughout those ceremonies in people where they became very ungrounded because they're hallucinating and having such a strong vision space. It became very difficult for the supposed healer to contain that space as well. So that admixture was put in there, and it's still done to this day. And I've heard about it many times from people and their own stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I want to change the tonality and maybe the facilitation a little bit. We've been circulating a lot around like our own, let's say, biographical nexus with the topic of the podcast and the phenomenon of ayahuasca at large. I feel like it's a good point when we talk about serving medicine in integrity to make this pretty structured. Before then we dive into the underbelly of the industry. So when imagine you're a newbie or you've had 2 or 3 experiences, what are the recommendations that you would give to people when they search for the right setting, the right ratio of facilitators, the right, let's say, group size, how the ceremony itself is held? Is there some preparation work done? Is there offered the possibility of integration so that we can offer that as a concise piece of takeaway for the listeners?
Absolutely. So depending on where a person is going, because the reality is some people can't make it to Peru, some people can't make it to Costa Rica, so they hear from their friends or someone that they know that went to ayahuasca retreat or ceremonies, and people automatically will start to look for what's available in their area, what's local to me, or maybe there's a place in the next state over or the next town over where there's ceremonies. And so just to have like a basic guideline of what to look for and questions that should be asked, no matter like what the space looks like. It's a little bit different with retreat centers because you can usually get a feeling for how these spaces are being held just through the website itself for established retreat centers. But going into ceremonies with people that might be holding it in their basement or their garage or their living room or something like that. So getting an understanding and a background of who are the facilitators, what is their experience? I think experience trumps everything else when it comes to this type of work, because even the most high-level psychologist or experienced breathwork facilitator or somatic therapist or something like that, if they have barely any experience with ayahuasca, for them to be able to try to navigate and understand energetically what's happening in that space, that only comes through personal experience with working with ayahuasca. So the experience should be very, very great when it comes to any like facilitator, of course. I think a rough estimate, what I would say, just my personal opinion, the person that is holding the space, I said this is just facilitating, not like the healer or the shaman, should have at least 100 ceremonies under their belts, specifically with ayahuasca, not 100 mushroom ceremonies or 100 MDMA ceremonies or something else specific to ayahuasca. Ideally, those facilitators also have plant dietas, which is a much deeper container. Plant dietas within an ayahuasca tradition, not wachuma or something else. And then when it comes to the healer, or even is there a healer? This is another thing, because in my early days, when I was just desperate to work with the medicine and kind of open to whatever was available, I was sitting in ceremonies where there wasn't a healer, it was a playlist, which I do not recommend ever, ever, ever. And so, yes, who is the healer? What is their background? Sometimes people will call themselves healer or give themselves that title And their healing is limited to, they're a Reiki healer, but they like ayahuasca, so now they're serving medicine, you know, and it's this type of stuff to really consider, who you're actually trusting your life and your mind with, going back to that whole, like, what's actually happening in a ceremony, and how deep do we go in those spaces. And so the ayahuasca healer, shaman, should have years and years and years and years of apprenticeship under their belts, not just like 1 or 2 diets. This is a very common thing here in Sacred Valley, that it's kind of like the running joke of a lot of people that live out in one of the towns called Pisac, which is a very medicine rich, of medicines of all sorts, rich place. And as people will say, like Gringoville, because there's a lot of Westerners that live there. But it's very common that Jungle Joe, who just spent a month in the Amazon at a mystery school or had his first dieta, the medicine, quote unquote, told him that he's ready to serve now. So now he's holding ayahuasca ceremonies in Pisac. And there's just this running joke about that, because it's unfortunately far more common than what we would hope it is. And so getting a clear understanding and background of who is the healer, how long have they been serving medicine, what's their experience, what was their apprenticeship like? And also an important question, who was their teacher? Because I can think of a few people whose teachers are not what I would say teachers I would ever want to meddle with, you know, and don't practice their own medicine work with the purity and light that it should be held in. So those types of things, just to get an understanding of who's running the space and who's holding the space. Asking how many people are going to be participating in that container. The more people that there are, inevitably, it's more energy. And the more energy, the harder it's going to contain, unless there are multiple people present. And even with that, if you consider, I'll just take from the Shipibo lens, let's say two to 3 healers in one space of even 24 people, that's still a lot of energy. 24 people in one space, or 30 people in one space, and there's, you know, 4 or 5 healers or something. It's still a lot to hold, especially considering what is coming out of people. This is a medicine where people are working with a purgative to literally clear, heal, and release trauma, clear, heal, and release things of their past, really heavy, dense energies that move by it coming out into the ceremony. So yeah, what's the ratio of facilitators to participants? That's another really important thing. The preparation process as well, because if people get called to serve medicine, they don't actually know what they're doing. That might be an invitation that they don't know who is a candidate for ayahuasca and who isn't. Meaning that there might be someone rolling into that space that was just partying over the weekend and still has cocaine in their system. How does that energetically impact the space? How does that impact everyone in the room? So those types of things. What's the preparation process with that? And then also on the other side of that, what is the integration support? As Todd mentioned, this was the same for me when I started. The integration was not a buzzword back then. It didn't really exist. You just showed up for your ceremony, and then once you leave, that's it. Good luck. You're on your own, and left to your own devices to kind of figure things out after that. But the integration support, especially nowadays, is key to how people are able to take this medicine and embody what they learned and bring it out into the real world and make those significant changes within themselves, which of course inevitably impacts their community, their families, their work, their friends, and everything. So is there preparation, integration support? Also, are there rules as far as when people are allowed to leave? What if there's that person, this happens sometimes, that people don't recognize how altered they actually are. They think that they're not in a very deep or altered state of consciousness, but then they try to get up to walk to the bathroom and they're stumbling, you know? And so if this person insists that they're not feeling anything and want to leave, what are the rules that are implemented to ensure that the safety of the ceremony is being held for everyone? And what if that person gets up and actually tries to leave? Are the facilitators experienced enough to either work with that person and just have some one-on-one time with them and help them to process everything that's happening? Or is there a unfortunate situation where that individual has to be pinned down because they're not ready to get in their car and drive home yet? You know, these types of things are really important to raise questions about and should be kind of like the basic guideline of what's the space that you're stepping into and how will it be contained and held?
Do you have anything to add to that? I think she was mentioning like the core points also that we shared in the prep. Todd?
Yeah, I would say that's the core of it. I would say when it comes to somebody that's wanting to get into facilitating, how many ceremonies they should have. She said 100, but that's personal ceremonies. That's personal, because some people will sit in on ceremonies and have a tiny little dose or something like that just to like get a feel for the space, or they're asked by the person that's running the ceremonies or the healer or whatever. But personal work, deep personal work, 100 min for sure. That was a standard that I started with as well. I like got to that point before I started training. So that's the other thing. It's like you got 100 ceremonies doesn't mean you're a facilitator. You need to train. That process itself is going to take as long as it needs to. It's going to be different for everybody. It's going to take as long as it needs to until you're ready. And your peers will know when you're ready. The person that's training you will know, people that are training you, actually, not just person. It's good to have people training you, for sure. That's the part of the community aspect of it all. The pre-preparation and like, so it'd be like, if it's just a ceremony in Tucson, Arizona or something, or if it's a retreat at a major ayahuasca center, you know, there's so many variations of what can happen, but the core is like, how are they preparing you? So you're in contact with somebody who's creating or running these ceremonies or retreats. It's really important about the preparation, and that they are telling you to adhere to the preparation. And it's not just what food you eat, it's the things that you abstain from. When it comes to like recreational drugs, pharmaceuticals, obviously some certain things you eat, sexual activity, things like that. That's why some people aren't ready for ayahuasca, because they're not willing to give certain things up. But what happens is some people that aren't willing to give certain things up, but they still want to come, then they hide what they've been doing and they come in and they've been polluted with recreational drugs. It's only going to be worse for them, but it's also going to be really difficult on the space, on the energy of the space and other people perhaps too. And then in that, even in the preparation, in the pre-part, the support, do you have a contact? Can you be in contact with somebody in case you have any questions or things come up? Because usually when people initiate that first, I'm going to do this moment, that's when things really start to happen. Even like the ceremony is now beginning, more or less. You haven't even drank the medicine yet. And for many, that's what we see. Many people experience that. And then, of course, the post ceremony or retreat support. That's also really important. Looking back, I had barely any pre-support. We had a list that was sent out to us. And then we got the secret location, like, I don't know, a couple days before the event. And it would say things like, don't eat overripe bananas, don't eat green beans, don't be off of cannabis for like a week before. Now we say as long as possible, 2 weeks, 1 month, these kinds of things. It's shifted quite a bit, actually. And we had no post ceremony. And these were ceremonies for us back then, or a weekend of like 2 or 3 ceremonies. Other than having the community and our group of people together, there was still nobody to really go to for support, even the healer that I was working with. It wasn't his thing, really. Like he offered support, but it wasn't like what we do now. And all of these experiences have really brought upon nowadays why we do what we do. It's like we've learned more what not to do from the past experiences than what to do. That has propelled a lot of how it is now and how things are really like the bridging of all the gaps. shining light on all of the blind spots in all of that, because of what we experienced ourselves. It was like, oh, this can be better. This actually has to be better. We don't want to leave anybody behind. And so those are the aspects that are really important about the post stuff, is like having a main line to somebody to reach out to talk to, for sure. Because it's like, you can go back and you can have your community, you can have your family and your friends, but sometimes there can be a misunderstanding or not a lot of understanding in that sense. And so having somebody or people that are connected with the medicine deeply to be able to guide and help in situations like that, that's important.
Before we dive into the underbelly of the ayahuasca industry, I feel like sharing something that I don't know if I shared in the preparation work. So I've spent in the last couple of years ceremonial spaces. So I've mainly touched upon two traditions, so the Shipibo and the Hunikuin, where subjectively, I sometimes had the feeling I have more experience than the not that experienced facilitators. And the way that I understood that was more, since I have now 100 ayahuasca ceremonies under my belt, as I learned how is the expression, I still would say I feel pretty newbie. I feel like I'm now in a not novice, but maybe apprenticeship stage. And when you look back at all, especially like monastic traditions, I think it's totally common that whatever you do, Zen or Vipassana, they would tell you do that for 10, 15, 20 years. And then the maestro out of that specific lineage would basically invite you into a deeper apprenticeship. So I feel like at least the three of us here are meeting with a very high degree of integrity and also humility to such a, let's say, strong intervention as is ayahuasca. So let's go into the juicy stuff, right? Super curious. I don't mind who starts, as you have both been working in the industry for quite a while. So when we talk about the underbelly of the ayahuasca industry, I just want to frame that to give it a little bit less of the moral undertone. I think the economic system at large, usually coined capitalism or late stage capitalism or something like that, has the tendency to commodify anything and everything out there. So sure, if I think of a big retreat institution that's spurred by VC money and people having a certain expectation on the return of the investment that such a retreat facility needs to produce, that has second and third order effects. Like maybe you change the ratio of the sum total of the participants and the facilitators just to cut costs. Maybe you allure people to join a ceremony, even if the three of us would say, maybe not the right person, not the right life circumstances. So I just feel like I want to frame the next part of the conversation and really just curious to listen in, mainly from the perspective of what have you learned from the experiences you had, and maybe also pointing into some of the things that you would strongly like not recommend to do to other people, but more come towards that, like where's the sweet spot of where you try to integrate that into your own setting, ratio of participants and facilitators, integration both after the ceremony as well as the preparation leading to the ceremony. So I don't mind who starts. Let's make this a juicy underbelly bit. Yeah.
I think it might be like a ping pong where we're kind of going back and forth because there is a lot to cover. One of the things that this is common for literally all full-time operating ayahuasca centers is the amount of time that the facilitators and the healers are working, because they're working in shifts and chunks and stuff like that, because most people aren't going to be living right next door to the ayahuasca center. Most people are going to be flying in to work in these spaces. And so one of the things that was very prominent for me working in large centers, and it's part of the nature of centers, large centers that are full-time, is you're there for many retreats in a row. Depending on the center, it could be like a couple of months, 2 or 3 months that you're working. The integrity of the work will naturally start to decline because people are tired, and the workers are tired, and the facilitators are tired, and the healers especially are tired. Because if you think of these like back to back to back to back groups of 20 people, 25 people, 30 people coming through, that one group leaves and the next one arrives, and there isn't a whole lot of downtime in between, because downtime means you're not earning any money. And so the way that schedules are created for the year and everything, and people filling in slots and everything like that, it's inevitably towards the end of every single shift, whether you're on the facilitation side or whether it's the healers, you're exhausted at that point. You're absolutely just exhausted. And depending on the group, some groups are, and you can't predict this either, some groups are easier and you feel like, okay, I'm all right after that one. And then one comes through where it's just a very, very heavy group, and they leave and you feel absolutely fried, like you need a week off, but you have one night off before the next group comes in. And of course, I can't speak for the side of the healers and everything, but I can only imagine if I'm this exhausted just facilitating, then the healers that are singing for 4 to 6 hours every single night for every ceremony and everything, how do they feel? And this is also why they usually have to go into a cleaning dieta as soon as they get back home to their families, just so that they can clean off energetically all the things that they were exposed to, or things that kind of like seep through the cracks within their own shields and protections and stuff of the healing work that they're doing. And then it's, maybe a chunk of time off and then going back in for another long shift. So I don't know what the answer to that would be, because obviously it costs the center a lot of money to have people come in, and if the center even pays for their travel funds and stuff like that. Some do, some don't. But a center has to be fully operational, running through 365 days a year for the most part, to satisfy their investors, or to keep the costs afloat and everything like that. And it does make the quality of the work go down towards the end of every shift, whether it's facilitator or healer.
And there's so much more to share. Todd.
There is the intake process as well, like how guests are not just onboarded, but like when somebody takes an interest in a retreat center or a retreat, and they reach out, and then how is the guest approved to attend the retreat? Because there has to be a screening process. Obviously, for what we've mentioned before, if somebody has a history of mental illness, a history of using pharmaceuticals, psychopharmaceuticals, things like that, because they are contraindicated with the medicine anyway. And so sometimes what mostly happens is people can come off of those meds, but they need support while they're coming off of those meds before they come. That's really important. So does the retreat center have that set up? So far, like as being a part of where I've worked before, they're doing the best that they can. That's for sure. There's always an evolution going on, and there's always blind spots that come up, even new things that come up or whatever. And then with the intake process, it's not just about contraindications. Are they checking for or with the person to see if they're actually like suited to be in an environment like that? Some people, it's a very classic thing. Some people want to come to heal at an ayahuasca center, but they're really not ready to be around a group. The last time they were around a group was summer camp when they were a child. or something like that. And it comes up often. It can feel very summer campy because then it becomes cliques of people. You got a group of 24 people. You're going to have like 5 people that really hone in on each other and hang out all the time. It becomes a little bit cliquey, and that can be confronting for some people. So that may not be the best place for somebody that wants to now deal with that. Sure, you could say that's part of their healing. That's another cliche. That's why you're here, right? You didn't know it, did you? Well, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that that needs to be another added thing on top of what they came in for. So then there's another aspect, like from my own experience, I have seen people that come in and they really shouldn't be with a group. It's like they just have a certain personality that is very disturbing. And there have been cases where I've had to be part of asking somebody to leave because they've been such a disturbance to the other group members, and even picking on other group members in the retreat and just things like that. You can only imagine what happens. It becomes adult summer boot camp with ayahuasca medicine. So that happens. Another aspect that comes up, just in regards to what Lacey was bringing up, is like the amount of physical work and the duration of the work that goes on for facilitators and for I just can't do anymore. I'm 48. I'm still strong, but I just know better now. The older I get, the better I know. But when I was younger, it was exciting. It was a thing to be part of a place and really getting into it when I went to the Amazon the first time. So many people coming through every month. They were running 3 centers on the same property, a main center, a second center, and then like a permaculture center. And so it was an exciting time, but there was like 100 people every month coming through this place. That's a lot of energy. So that's the thing, is like physically it's very demanding, because especially if you're working in ceremony, you're having meetings, you're getting up for breakfast, you're having meetings in the daytime, group shares, all sorts of things going on just in the daytime, especially in the beginning of a retreat. And then you've got the ceremonies. And when I was at the temple, they were having 7 ceremonies in 12 days. That's a lot. Nowadays, it's 4 ceremonies in like 8 days, or 3 and 5. It's kind of like these new averages, which seem to work pretty well. But we were getting burned out quite a bit, and we only had 2 or 3 days off in between each retreat a month. And that gave us enough time just to get back to some sort of stasis to be able to keep going. And I would be there for like 3 months sometimes. So it was through this that we really had to also learn to lean on each other, create different ways of doing things, and have that. And that's why there's more facilitators per capita for guests as well. That's really important. It's also really taking care of the healers, for sure, so that they're not, because they're in ceremony working so hard with the guests, with what they do. And yes, they're trained for it, but still, it's like they're not used to that either. It's a very new thing. So I think that's the aspect that needs to also be touched upon, is the modern ayahuasca movement with larger centers. It's centers say it's traditional. It's not traditional really at all. Not at all. The Maloka space for the Shipibo, that's not a traditional building. Even just things like that. There's aspects that are like, yes, you're using a traditional medicine. They're singing in a traditional language and doing things in a traditional way, but the way that things are set up, that's not traditional at all. And so through that, when I look back on first going to the Amazon, there were also many other centers. There were upwards of maybe a dozen legitimate centers in Iquitos itself. Legitimate meaning they have a website, they're credible, but there were over 50 centers in total. So you've got a high percentage of other centers that are, they have their own property, and then just fly by night things going on as well, utilizing this image of what is traditional and what is indigenous, and working on this modern corporate structure, a way of doing things it's not at all traditional. I mean, that's one thing for me that I really need to speak about, especially after being part of that for many years so far. And so that's why for us, you know, with Lacey starting Intertwining Medicines, that's what was the beautiful part about us coming together, because I was really getting a call while I was still working, even at the first center and at the second center, this deep call to want to get back to what is traditional, having more space, more time, more ease, so that we can really go deep and have strength in it and focus better. Smaller groups of people as
But
well too.
I'm trying to sense into the bridge, into the amalgamate you're building yourself. So what I get is almost like in any very structured corporate environment that you were both working as facilitators, you had the feeling you're working long shifts, it's getting exhausting to the point of burnout. It feels like things are propagated, like the shiny, you know, aura of the brand and the outreach. Poor assessment, almost anybody, you know, gets access to showing up in the ceremony, to then trying to distill for the two of you and those in your team what are more healthy, more sane, deeper ways of working with the medicine. And I'm curious, from, you know, to not overwhelm the audience with details, what are those nuggets of wisdom out of own painful experience that you're distilling into a setting and a process design which makes your work in the Sacred Valley so unique?
I think the connection to the healer is really important, because that's like in one aspect that healer who is bringing in the indigenous wisdom of the Amazon rainforest, that there's a huge separation at larger centers, and with good reason. They're very separate from like eating on their own time and staying in their own little spaces and stuff like that. And there isn't a whole lot of time or space outside of well, let's have a consultation really quick with the healer. Because it's kept so separate, it's like, okay, the Westerners go to this building when they're eating, they go here and everything. And only when it's applicable to this one context of speaking about a trauma or a healing or something like that. But otherwise, there's a huge disconnect. And it's amazing to have the healers that we work with, mostly Maestro Nelson, as Todd mentioned. He's very much a part of the group the whole time. He's eating with us. If people have questions about the Shipibo tradition and just like what it's like where he lives and what it's like in his family, and are his children interested in ayahuasca, curanderismo, and are there any other healers? And it's very personal. And that's something that is lost with the big centers, is because they're a big center and you're walking into this corporate machine. It's like you don't get that access, you don't get that personalization that you would normally have if you were to go to a curandero in a traditional setting in a village. You'd be able to actually have a conversation with that person. And a lot of the people that do come to us are interested in learning more about ayahuasca and more about plant medicine. We do get people that come in for their first time and everything like that, but people who stay on the path get more curious and ask different types of questions than just a newcomer, because they want to know about the energetics of the space and the dynamics of the space, and when you're in apprenticeship, what happens and things like that. So there's there's a growing need for ayahuasca development, is what I call it, in the ayahuasca community as a whole, because it's like, it's what's available. If you just do like random Google searches or something like that, it's either you're going to the big center, which caters to a lot of first timers, or it's either that or straight into diets. There doesn't seem to be a space for growth in between. And the majority of people are not ready to just go from a center into a dieta. It's like they're two totally different types of healing containers and things like that. And most people will never need to have a plant dieta in their life. But it's like there isn't kind of like an intermediate space for people to get to understand the tradition a little bit more and get to know the healer, have more time with the facilitators, because in a small group, there's a lot more spaciousness as opposed to a large center when there's 2 or 3 facilitators in a group of 24 to 30 people being pulled in a lot of different directions because so many people need help. So that's where the ratio of the staff to facilitators is also really important. For us, it's for every 5 guests, there's 1 of us. We have a group maximum of 10, and we'll never go above that. And yeah, that's a big difference also with just the bigger centers and everything like that. They do have high overhead costs because they're big and they have a lot of people to pay, and who knows how much the property that they built on and everything that like they're making payments of and everything. But those are the types of things that do get missed in a big center versus like small intimate group settings.
Anything you want to add to that, Todd?
So many things to say. I think in relation to, I mean, everything that Lacey was talking about in that respect. Yeah, really, I don't have much more to add. Yeah.
I think before I want to go into a short, really like taboos and no-goes, like hard red flags, there's 2 things that in my own experience have changed pretty drastically. So one of which I would call the ayahuasca industry at large, where I think I certainly recommend, and you did second that quite a bit, do your own research and prepare for the set and setting. Do you really want to be part of a ceremony with 20, 30, 40 people and more in a rather corporate setting? Some people also love it. You know, they want 5-star and a heated outdoor pool and a famous chef and maybe a famous musician for the Afterglow. I'm not totally against it. I think it's a certain flavor you get, much like when you go on a music festival, right? There's like whatever, tens of thousands of different possibilities. The second thing that I want to explore before we go into this like hard red flags is I also really feel, and I still don't really get it, is this like spiritual narcissism that comes. And before I hand over to you and then we have a juicy short conversation about that, I really find it staggering that especially ayahuasca, like completely counterintuitively to my own experience, it seems some people are literally just inflating their egos instead of getting rid of them and getting humble. And there's also a certain profile that I know and is part of my everyday, every week experience, like famous serial entrepreneur, impact investor, had a couple of exits. So generally like strong, masculine, alpha male guy, where I then would say, okay, you did like 10 years of ayahuasca. I really know some of these people, but I don't really have the feeling like the core of the essence, much like sitting in Vipassana or going into a monastery, really like breaking your ego and being more humble instead of they're inflating their ego. So I'm curious to circle around that inflation of the ego and what are ways in a peer group setting, to counterbalance that.
It is a thing. It is a thing in the ayahuasca world. When we talked in our prep work about this, that ayahuasca can act as an amplifier. You know, it's like the medicine isn't going to just come into someone and they drink it, and it's going to now implant a bunch of things that are already weren't there. Maybe they were dormant before, such as like a raging ego that was just on the cusp of blooming into fullness there. But yeah, it can absolutely act as an amplifier to grandiosity and yeah, just taking things to an extreme, and power and greed and control. And some people unfortunately get into ayahuasca apprenticeship for that very thing, because they perceive the healer as this strong, like you said, kind of alpha male, a strong presence or energy in the room and everything. And if someone has not done enough of their own inner work or their shadow work, that can be very alluring to want to like dive deeper into apprenticeship so they can be the almighty shaman or call themselves master shaman. And we're like, this is where the humility is absolutely important. And working with someone that is grounded through all of that, of course, like having strength and having power in ceremony is definitely needed, and it's an asset to any shaman or healer and everything. But how do they hold that power? And are they constantly reminding people of their power or of their mastery, or they're the almighty gatekeepers of the spirit world? You know, like just watching people's language is really important when it comes to this kind of a thing, and how they posture themselves, how they position themselves, how they describe themselves, and that type of thing. But it is unfortunately common. And as you said before yesterday, it doesn't seem to be as prominent in like the shaman, the shamanistic world of mushrooms, and not very common in like the Wachuma community. It seems to be more with ayahuasca for sure.
Yeah, I really wonder before, because I reckon you also want to share what I find very staggering with ayahuasca. And again, you know, experienced, but still like early apprentice or something like that. Ayahuasca has something inherently very dual. So if you're not aware of your back doors in your consciousness for witchery, black magic, manipulation, you can learn so much from these, I would say, dark side of the force, you know, because you literally can see it and sense it. Todd, I think it's also a beautiful segue into the no-goes, but do you want to share something about this like ego inflation?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so common. And one very common thing is like coming in as when I was as a facilitator, or guests coming in while I was a facilitator, and there's like they're talking about why they've come, and it's like I'm here to kill my ego. And it's like, okay, cool. I remember hearing that and going through things like that myself early on, even before ayahuasca, ego and all of that. But then I started to see more and more, it's like, and learn from other people and teachers and things. It's like, it's about the healthy relationship, right? With the ego, having balance and equanimity in ourselves, because the ego's a very important part of ourselves too. And it's like you said, the ego can be hyperinflated as well. And the medicine can be very confronting. Ayahuasca can be very confronting to people who are in a hyperinflated, egotistical state, because that mirror comes up. And what it can do is actually, sometimes I've seen it can make it even more so. And it can put people off, send people off in directions that's going to take them a little while longer to come back on their path. But again, that's all part and parcel of their journey, their karma, whatever. But I think there's also that part about having accountability in a community. And so there are medicine people and practitioners that definitely have a hyperinflated ego, that have followers because they created that for themselves, because they also follow their own gurus. They always have someone on a pedestal, and then they want to be on the pedestal. And sometimes it's a very subconscious thing that's just coming very outward and prevalent in the outer world, in this place. Whether people in that place are aware of it or not, I don't know. I we can only maybe wonder or just try to understand what's going on there. But it's definitely something that is a part of ayahuasca ever since I started. And those were, or that was the major red flag, as I mentioned something earlier about why I took a bit of a break early on because of the egotistical nature of the people that were running the ceremonies. And I could see how that was affecting other people that were, they have their own open backdoor shadows going on, and it feeds that too. So then they get into it as well. These are the things to look out for, as well as like another thing to look out for is like any time that somebody is seeking fame or notoriety, or it's all about the money, really pay attention to that, to the way that what's their relationship with money. And of course, power and influence. Power and influence over people. I mean, what else is there kind of? And so those are major, major red flags, especially when I see people that are not humble. They're very extravagant. There can be people that are humble and extravagant, their character. Maybe like you.
Maybe like all three of us. I think it's a beautiful segue into really like hard nose, hard red flags. You want to tie into that from and dovetail into what Todd just shared? I mean, there's one thing about being like funky or a little bit extravagant, but what are I'm curious to listen in because I think your answer as a feminine human being and Todd's as a masculine human being might slightly be different. So what are hard red nose, Lacey?
A hard red nose, especially if someone is already committed to a retreat or ceremonies, is boundaries that have been crossed. That could be physical boundaries. If someone is becoming verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, manipulating. Manipulation goes on like in so many different directions as well. If they're already trying to get you to sign up for the next ceremony or for the next retreat and you haven't even really landed from your experience yet, big red flag. And unfortunately, there are centers out there that do that. And so, especially from a woman's perspective, and a lot of women come to these spaces, not at all to say that this doesn't happen for men too. There's vulnerable men that come into spaces, especially regarding like sexual trauma and things like that. But women are coming into these healing containers sometimes feeling extremely vulnerable, extremely exposed, and with a lot of wounding of being able to trust the space holders and trust the healer, and things like that. So if there's been a physical violation of boundaries, inappropriate touching, the facilitator or the healer, because it does happen with both sometimes, that they're getting hit on, or there's an invitation to come to my room to let me process you, let me do more healings on you in my tambo or in my bedroom, or so, like these are huge red flags, glaring red flags, that if that comes up, absolutely say no, and leave. That's not a safe space to be in.
Todd?
Absolutely, that's something I experienced with healers as well too, early on. And so there's this thing that can come out sometimes is like cultural differences. But when it comes to these things, cultural differences, no, it doesn't matter. When there's a line that's crossed, especially sexual exploitation, things like that, that's such a huge one, obviously. And then energetic manipulation. That is something that I've seen, I've experienced myself, I've heard about way too much in that respect. And then another thing too is manipulation in the form of healers reaching out to guests afterwards. And this is something that's a big no-no when you're working for a big retreat center. And if it's not, it should be, is healers contacting guests afterwards, because what happens sometimes it's a low average, but it still happens. So it's not great. What happens is there's a manipulation involved, and they get the healer reaches out through social media, reaching out to these guests. They're connecting with them and asking them for money. That was actually quite a cliche common thing, but asking them or offering them plant dietas or ceremonies where they're based and things like that. And there really should be a bridge or a connection between the retreat center where the guest first started and that healer. If there's going to be a connection, it should not be a roundabout way of doing that. That's a big caution for sure, because that's also, as I've been saying, it's manipulative as well, because especially again, if one of the red flags that comes up is about money. And I know people recently that have told me about their instances of these things happening, and I've known of more. Unfortunately, dare I say, it's a classic thing that happens, but just to put that information out there of what to be looking out for, what to be aware of. And a lot of this too, I wanted to say earlier, is like really trusting and honing in on your gut instinct. If there's any indication that something's slightly off, that's usually you're coming into feeling that something is potentially really off with this person.
Yeah, I would like to have known the things I now know at the age of 45, after 13 to 14 years in the industry and having done so many ceremonies, to better trust my intuition. I want to dive into the next piece, which I know we won't do that intense, but like sketch high level, which has to do with manipulation. I want to paraphrase it, because for those of you, of the listeners who have already done psychedelic experiences, but also for those who have not done, you're really entering onto, let's say, a different frequency. So you're perceiving the world on a in a completely different way, and you're becoming way more aware of the finer energies, like the thoughts you're sending out, the emotions shared in the room, a connection to the ancestral planes, to a lot of the different collective entities out there. Some people call them egregores, like in all shapes and forms and sizes, in beautiful deities, but also in like ugly monsters and demons. So let's segue into like black magic, and maybe the best way to use it, because that's how I perceive it's done, at least those that I've witnessed, is like people are getting, sometimes, not always, but they may get manipulated. So Lacey, from your own experience and also the indigenous background, because they're using these techniques, these psycho-spiritual techniques, also really to gain and amplify personal power, gain wealth, gain status, gain influence, gain territory and stuff like that. So I'm just curious to enter into the conversation around black magic.
This is almost its own podcast, this topic. And I want to start off by saying that black magic in plant medicine shamanism is exceptionally nuanced. It's very, very, very nuanced. And just to give an example, like sometimes things can come up in ceremony for people where they're having dark visions or they're having a dark experience. And it's very easy to think that that is entirely external of you. Like my visions just went black. I'm seeing demons. There's like devils in the room, however that is. And to think that it's everyone else, that it's not coming outside of that individual. A lot of the time, it's the projection of our own mind and the things that we are already carrying that is translating into the vision of the, it's its own topic. But yes, these things do exist. And I also want to make it clear that it's not exclusive to plant medicine shamanism. Black magic exists in inverted paganism and in voodoo and in secret societies. There's like all types of different all types of different like black magic. and it's specifically called brujeria in plant medicine shamanism. So usually the driving force for a shaman to utilize these types of dark arts is exactly for what you said. It's for power, it's for energy. That's another thing. The term, I think, is more commonly accepted than it ever has been before, but energy vampires, so to speak, that are not shamans or anything, but we could, I'm sure all of us can think of someone that we've known in our life that is like an energy vampire, where we feel exhausted or drained after being around that person because they're just constantly taking energy. That's also very real in plant medicine shamanism for someone that is utilizing dark arts for something like that. So they can do it to draw on energy, they can do it to draw on their own ego, and a lot of it does boil back down to money, to gain more influence over somebody's mind, to manipulate them into donations, or maybe, as Todd mentioned, hey, come down to the center I'm building, let me give you a plant dieta, you need more healing, I saw something in you, come train with me, this type of a thing. And unfortunately it does happen. I think even when I first started with ayahuasca, I had this I was wearing these rose colored glasses that's all light and love. No one would ever do something like that, right? Aren't the healers the most enlightened beings, type of a thing? They know how to navigate these crazy dimensions and astral travels, and they know how to go into these spiritual battles. So it's like I again place them on these like pedestals of you know, they know all this higher knowledge than me and everything like that. But at the end of the day, everyone in ceremony is still human. The facilitators are still human, the healers are still human, the guests are, it's like we all have our own personal stuff to work on. And this is where it's really important to continue to do the shadow work and the shadow integration on the path of medicine, which I don't think that's a number one priority, especially within indigenous traditions. The term even shadow work is more common in like the field of psychology, and that type of a thing. With Westerners, that term doesn't exist in indigenous traditions, not at all. However, there's a lot of healers out there that work with the medicine in a very clear, beautiful, light aligned way that is very pure. And they might not have had to do a lot of like shadow work to stay aligned with the light. However, people that apprentice into these traditions and learn how to manipulate and how to put tubes or cords onto people and stuff like that, that have their own trauma that is unresolved, that of course that sits in their subconscious and is often the governing force, that they're not even aware of why they want to pull money from that person, why they want to pull energy from that person over there and things like that. And so it's just something that unfortunately does exist. And I think it's important that people are aware of what can happen in those spaces, and that it's around, but Black magic is around in all cultures, all traditions, and everything like that around the world. So it's not exclusive, as I said before, with the plant medicine community and everything, but yeah, it exists, and it does need to be brought into the light of awareness little by little, in my opinion, just because, as I said, it's extremely nuanced, and I think most people are not going to encounter brujeria or Black magic if they just go to a center for a one-off retreat or something. The majority of people are probably not going to be hexed or cursed or anything like that, but it does happen. And sometimes it is with a person that, you know, was unsuspecting and had no idea that it even exists. And I think more people, the people that are going to be more likely to be targeted are the people that are working at centers, the people that are around healers that might also be like Black magic practitioners. They can be both, actually. Because they develop these relationships and ongoing work and shared spaces and stuff with these Black magic practitioners. As you continue on with the friendship or the relationship or something like that, that's what is going to make someone more likely to be targeted than just like a random guest in a random retreat, as so many people are passing through a large center or something like that. Unfortunately, I have had quite a bit of experience with brujeria and black magic, and one actually quite recently, and it was the most horrible and scariest thing I have literally ever been through in my life. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but that was also the catalyst for me to write some posts recently on social media just to start bringing it into the topic of conversation, because most people that are signing up for an ayahuasca retreat or even an ayahuasca ceremony in the United States or Europe or something like that have absolutely no idea that it exists. Zero clue. And so that's been my intention with just bringing it more into conversation. Let's have a conversation about it and bringing it into the light.
Yeah, hence also us giving it space. And it's very interesting that you shared that less so from a participant's perspective. Also, I have luckily, or unbeknownst to my knowledge, not experienced like black magic or brujeria onto me, but it seems to be pretty prevalent for people that are undergoing deeper apprenticeship and serving themselves and acting as facilitators. And this I've heard since years. So Todd, curious, is there anything you want to add to what Lacey just shared before we dive into the last bit of the podcast?
Yeah, I just want to say too, it's all too, it's very common. And it's also in some traditions or family lineages, it's just a very accepted and common thing. Due to jealousies, disputes, wars, attacks, things that have been going on for a short period of time or a very long period of time as well. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's too common in that sense. And I've had my own experiences with it. From day one, when I first started working with ayahuasca, this black magic brujeria thing was present. And basically, for me, my first experience happened in 2008. Something happened to me and I became sick for a couple of years. And I didn't know what was going on at the time, but I kind of forgot what happened in the ceremony that started it all. Something happened. I don't feel that it was something that was started by anybody in that space. It was actually somebody outside of that space as well. So that was my first introduction to that kind of thing. And it's happened to me various times throughout this experience with medicine. But that's because I was also working closely and so deeply embedded in these places. And so, like Lacey said, most people are never going to experience something like this. It can be somewhat alluring or enchanting for people to get into this topic and whatever, but it is extremely nuanced as well. Extremely nuanced. And on the human aspect of it, the human perspective of it, there's people that are very corruptible. That's just the way it is. And so they act out and they go, it's very Star Wars in a sense. It's very Harry Potter. It's very Matrix. It's very Star Wars. The hero's journey of things. And so most of what's happened to me and the experiences that I've had or the experiences that I've heard of through or with close friends or companions or people more on the outside, it's just, it doesn't surprise me because apart from it being black magic, there's so much darkness going on in the world already in that respect too. And so it's kind of part and parcel. We want to work with the light, then we got to get to know the darkness. We got to get to know the shadow in that sense. And so from the experiences that I've had and the things that have been sent my way, it's like, sounds crazy, but I'm grateful for those because I'm even better for that, because that darkness, those types of things, they'll never win. They'll never win. Fear is the mind killer, essentially. So it's like when we start working with aspects like this, sometimes these things come through. And like Lacey said, it's quite natural in ceremony, in vision space and things like that. You're going to experience some gnarly looking things, or you're going to experience some gnarly feeling things. Doesn't mean it's black magic. It's part of being human, I think. It's part of the human experience. And that gets exemplified and that gets exacerbated sometimes with plant medicines. I have it with mushrooms early on, things like that. So that's one thing to really just keep in check, I think. And also it's just like anytime anybody goes that way, they can always come out of it. That's their work that they have to do. When you cross the line and you start hurting somebody, whether it's physically or energetically, whatever, it's crossed a line. And I used to have a way different reaction to that. And what it's taught me is a deeper aspect of the questioning I had about what is compassion. So did I do this to myself? I don't know. It's all come in that way, but it's really teaching me things about compassion and understanding about people and why they go that way, why people make choices to do things like this in that respect. So it's not just black magic, it's encircled in both sides of the dichotomy of it all, essentially.
So
Something I'd like to add really quick, if that's okay.
Sure.
When I started to become vocal and public about what was happening to me from a very specific healer who was still employed and holding these spaces for other people, people, when they were asking, because it's such a big topic, and it's yeah, we could talk for days about it. One of the most common question I would get is, why is this healer, why is she doing this to you? Like, why? And I think my first response to that is like, why? If someone is even asking the question why, we're already establishing we're not operating on the same level of consciousness. We're not on the same frequency. If the person sending that is not asking themselves why, or even questioning about what they're doing, that's as useful as asking why is someone murdering someone in another corner of the world right now? Why is someone abusing their partner or their children? Or it's like, it's literally coming from a place of like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to understand this, but working in this industry and working with ayahuasca for as long as I have, and just in the general field of healing, it always boils down to trauma. I don't think anyone is born like inherently evil or inherently demonic or something like that. It's their life situations and how they grew up and their own unresolved stuff that creates monsters. And we can even like apply this to politicians or people in the world that are in control, unelected officials, or however that plays out. It's like that's what's going on in the world, but there's also the microcosm aspect of that also happening in like the plant medicine community and in these spaces that we would hope and pray there aren't predators, but there are. And as Todd was just mentioning, like having gone through experiences with brujeria and this most recent one, it really forced me to kind of watch my own emotional reactions to it, because I had very, very strong emotional reactions, of course, as this person was like trying to kill me in my sleep every night, for example. But also like what happened to that person that would drive them to the point that they're making these decisions now consciously, and they're okay with themselves doing this and calling themselves a healer, and like, what happened to you? What happened to you when you were a child that brought you to where you are here and now, making these decisions, and you're totally okay with it, and it's trauma, it's unresolved pain. And obviously someone who is willing to cause so much harm and pain for somebody else, I can't imagine the pain that she's in every single day for whatever has happened to her and whatever has gone on in her life and everything like that. And where do I stand on that level of compassion? Am I able to give the same compassion to this individual that was trying to hurt me for a month and a half straight successfully hurt me for a month and a half straight, can I hold that same compassion for her as I do for anyone else that enters like our ayahuasca healing containers and everything. So it was a really important and valuable lesson in that regard, even though I would never, ever, ever wish anyone to go through what that put me through.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of sticking to my preparation, I have more the feeling we do another podcast. Maybe in a different constellation, because I started off my series of my podcasts with a lot of group conversations, because honestly, I find them in a way more emergent and more juicy, and then went to one-on-one. So this is the first three-way conversation I'm live recording. I feel I want to share more a summary out of my own learning journey, and end with a checkout, and then hand over to either one of you. So what I learned also preparing is that medicine, like the medicines out there, are very different for whatever reason. And this is in other podcasts. I have a lot of experience with, like, let's say, the different healing modalities and also the different medicines attached to where I think they really help. And what strikes me most is like ayahuasca is very potent, and for whatever reason, it opens up the inner eye to the grand polarities out there. So I don't know if I've ever met any person who has 100 ceremonies under the belt who has not been exposed to realms of black magic and power, and how could I use what I just was processing to gain more power and more fame and more money and manipulate other human beings. So I find that a really interesting quintessence of a deeper knowledge of ayahuasca. That's one thing. The second thing is, since the industry is growing so fast, to those listeners who made it up until the very end, I can really just recommend a deep due diligence and rather ask 2 or 3 people more for a recommendation up until you make your own choice for undergoing such a strong intervention, as not needing to repeat, for example, all the mistakes that I made. And then maybe lastly, where I think I was actually very fortunate, is ideally where you are, second best online, make sure you have people that know spaces like ayahuasca, or at least have an ample experience of other psychedelic spaces and can offer you methodologies, a toolkit, trauma integration for really post ceremony. So with that, I think I feel like good for a checkout. I feel incredibly grateful for having shared that conversation, also the preparation sessions. And yeah, there's definitely a part in my soul which feels like ready for apprenticeship. But again, there my benchmark is pretty high. Like, how can I create the boundary conditions in my everyday life as a busy entrepreneur to not then just, venture out, create a product, sell the product, and Alistair suddenly, lead ceremonies. But how can I make the space for maybe a multi-year long process as to grow into my own knowledge, wisdom, to work with a plant as potent as ayahuasca. So that was a long checkout. I don't mind who wants to go second. So yeah, Todd or Lacey for a checkout.
Yeah, I'll go. I think one thing just to come off of what you said about, yeah, just making sure that, and this is something I used to say, is like, when you're finding a recommendation, just not the recommendation off your one friend. It's like, find more than one recommendation, 3 or 4 and recommendations from people that don't know each other. That's also something I used to say quite a bit. One thing that I want to bring up too is, like, you bring up, it's a fast growing industry. And what is the forthcoming thing that's going to be happening is legalization around the world in different countries. This is going to shift things incredibly, incredibly. in the amount of time that I've been connected with the medicine and been seeing it grow in the last 20 years, it's been immense in the last 20 years. Even though some things are still kind of going the same way back in Canada, it's still underground. It's not legal, but it's more prevalent. I guarantee I'm just not part of it anymore. And so thinking ahead in this ever evolving landscape of this, what do we need to prepare for, at least for now? And that's part of what I'm always thinking of when I think of this in relation to this. It's like, okay, it became legal in Oakland, a very small, tiny pocket. But when it becomes legal in California, or legal in Holland, or wherever, countrywide, legal in Canada, amazing. But from what I saw with the cannabis industry, when it became legal, that's when I really shifted my perspective with cannabis, for sure. That's a whole other podcast. And so I have concerns. I definitely have concerns.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to be a gatekeeper about things. That's pretty cringy these days. But I feel like I need to be present with this as obviously coming more and more into some shape, for sure. Because after all this time, I feel like I owe that to ayahuasca. And there's this thing again that I'm reminded of, that who is really running the show here? Because we're talking about ayahuasca and the medicine, and us human beings are taking this medicine. We're drinking it. We're really the only ones doing this. And we're working with this benevolent and quite grand spirit. It's what's involved with it. And so anytime that I come back to looking for guidance, it's ayahuasca. I also work with tobacco, and it's tobacco as well, another plant, right? And so not forgetting that aspect, come out of our human selves. Don't forget that when we're working with these plants, we're working with these plants. They have an energy, and they have an intelligence, and they have a sentience.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah,
They deserve
I feel
reverence.
you totally.
So thank you so much for this. And I think we need to just keep going with another one at some point.
Absolutely. That's how I feel too. Lacey.
Yeah.
For sure. Yes, thank you so much for this platform and this space to speak about things that hopefully reach all the right people that need to hear, and that feel more inspired to, do more research. Come back to that. Do your research, do your research, do your research. And I think intentionality is always really, really important in these spaces, of course, with healing containers and ayahuasca and everything like that. And sometimes just taking a step back and asking, no matter like what the center or the ceremony space holder and everything like that, what's the intention? And also like, what's my intention as the person stepping into that space as a participant and everything? What's my intention? What's the intention of everyone here as well? And also bring it back to like the priority of safety. It should always be number one priority in any set and setting. And this goes beyond ayahuasca. This could be for any type of ceremony. This goes into like psychedelic therapy healing work as well. This could be applied for just like the whole medical system, like prioritize safety. Always, 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 that should be number one. And looking at the ways that we can just elevate the whole community as a whole. And I feel like that's more, I really don't want to like try to take on this role of like justice warrior in the ayahuasca community or something, or speak from like the throne of righteousness or something. I'm still very human and learning on my own path and everything like that. But I've definitely learned some things over the years, and I'm super happy to share that with anyone who wants to listen or anyone that is curious, just if that can prevent situations that I was in, or prevent crappy things from happening, or even prevent harm, then it's worth it to speak up and use my voice. And hopefully it helps to elevate the community as a whole. So thank you for this time and space with you, Alistair. Thank you, Todd, my wonderful partner.
Gracias, mi amor.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think I want to end after the checkout. For me, truly, especially ayahuasca is a big mystery. It's like an ultimate teacher in not knowing. And when we look back into the Vedas, you know, all that's left is like the things we did not know, the things we don't know, to carve out what, again, we will find out what we don't know, and to serve the community at large, I think, and approaching that with humility. So I was really very touched both by the depth of the expertise and, yeah, the many decades of shared experience in that room together. So thanks for that. And yeah, speak another time. Thanks so much. Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Ciao, ciao.